Paul Newman, who's much in the news because of a biodoc about him and his wife, and they were the last great movie star couple. They don't have those exactly anymore. And we discussed, was Paul Newman an alcoholic? And we said, well, we don't use the term alcoholic for starters. And he doesn't come in our minds as a person defined especially prominently by his use of alcohol. That's the wrong way to go in general, and it doesn't work for him. But it brings up a question that we also discussed. Should we ever use the term addiction or alcoholism? And I want to summarize again. I felt, yes, we can use that, but we would never use the term addict or alcoholic. Do you want to jump in here what you're thinking about these topics?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the idea of labeling somebody an alcoholic or an addict as their essence is a bad idea. That's a hyper focus on a problem instead of a whole person who has skills and dreams and hopes. But addiction's a meaningful concept, because if that's something that somebody is focusing on and it's a hurdle that they like to overcome or a space they'd like to clean out, then that works. I mean, there's something that's defining something that's real in a person's life.
And this is one more way. The Life Process Program, whatever it is, we're not the disease model of addiction. And the American Society of Addiction Medicine, it begins by saying this: alcoholism is a primary disease, by which they mean you have that and everything else results.
Right.
We're the opposite. We're what else is going on and everything else results. Let's get back to alcohol. And that, the Life Process Program, by its name, suggests that it's what's going on in your life that we're going to fine tune, maybe a little facile way of explaining. That's what we're going to work on.
By the way, just a callback to, I don't know how many months ago or a year ago, we did a question about values, and Maya Solovitz and I had a conversation about values, and we're always charged with this idea of just talking about values means you're moralizing the problem. Someone's bad or good, or they should value things that they don't. But this is people come to our program often and say, I've never felt like I had a problem with alcohol. I'm kind of just living my life. My wife thinks I have a problem with alcohol. I care about my wife, so I need to clean this mess up somehow. And so that's a negotiation that includes someone's alcohol use, sort of like we just discussed Paul Newman recently. He had all of these successes in his life, and then there were questionably times where his kids felt he was absent, his wife felt he was going too hard, and I would imagine he would want to clear that kind of a space up. So this is where
values as therapeutic levers. With all due respect to Maya is very woke, and it's very negative today to talk about values. You're not allowed to talk about values. Here's how I imagine her thought process is: oh, we're valuing other people down. But that's not our job in the Life Process Program, is to tap into their values.
To stick with this example, it would be something like, it's possible, then motivational interviewing is helpful here. It's possible you don't value your relationship, but you're telling me you do, and you do value whatever else is going on in your life, including maybe the level of drinking that you have now. Maybe that's useful to you. But if they're competing, then you have to figure out how you want to prioritize those values and weave them together some cohesive way. So talking about values is, in essence, the beginning issue there. I mean, you can't get around that.
And we don't impose our values. We're clinically bound that they're going to harm somebody. But if somebody wants to have multiple relationships, we don't tell them you're not allowed to do that. First of all, they wouldn't listen.
Right.
Second of all, we don't believe that, it's not our business. And it's ironic. I think somebody like Maya would, in fact, be much more moralistic than we would. And maybe she's projecting that when we talk to people about values, that we want them to behave a certain way. We want them to behave in a pro-social way, in the most generic way possible, pro-values in terms of their values.
Right.
So if you look up definitions of addiction, if you Google addiction, of course, you're going to get 500 definitions that say addiction is a primary chronic relapsing brain disease. And, a lot of times they begin by saying, let's just get it straight. Everybody knows addiction is a disease. But in fact, one write-up, here's a DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders by the American Psychiatric Association. It's not a disease manual. And they think that sounds very scientific. Oh, it's a brain disease. Not one human being in the world is diagnosed as being addicted or alcoholic by a brain scan.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such thing. All of the criteria, by the way, I mentioned this quite a bit. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association does not use the term addiction or alcoholism with regards to drugs. It only uses the term addiction in regards to behavioral addictions, and it only names one addiction, gambling. So put that in your pipe and smoke it if that is not addictive. So DSM doesn't define addiction, it defines substance use disorders. And substance use, and it certainly doesn't use brain scans. There's not one brain scan in DSM, and there's not one brain scan in the world that tells people whether they're addicted or not. Substance use disorders are patterns of symptoms resulting from the use of a substance. This write-up happens to be inaccurate because there's also behavioral addictions that you continue to take despite experiencing problems as a result. The DSM-5 criteria for substance use disorders are based on decades of research and clinical knowledge. And the criteria are a list of things that are going wrong in your life potentially. Some of them are physical and sleeping. Most of them are things that we've discussed: health, family, success at life and work, distress. The two basic things underlying all diagnoses in DSM are impairment and distress. And those are the two things that we always key in. We've been talking in the past about Paul Newman and James Boswell. If you're sort of the greatest or close to the greatest in the world at what they do, impairment doesn't seem like a good word. Potentially, they both had distress, and distress is something that we address. But what the definition of addiction, which DSM doesn't have, is all predicated on what you and the person can see and experience in front of you. And all of that is predicated on, and we've discussed this recently in terms of psychedelic therapy and medical therapies of all kinds. It's predicated on the person's lived experience and their mindfulness about themselves and how they see their lives. You cannot escape those things and help a person deal with addiction or help society deal with addiction.
Yep.
And so our therapy for addiction is a matter of keying into those things not labeling people, not presuming a chemical imbalance or some imagined brain scan result. It's about who they are, what they're experiencing. And we are willing, can you just reiterate, when would you be willing to say that a person was addicted? And I think I want to ask you, were you addicted at one point in your life?
Mhm.
What would make you say that a person is addicted?
Kind of with the DSM on this one. I mean, even though they don't use the term addicted, well, addiction is there impairment and distress in their lives? Is it the result of their pattern of use, and does it, or whatever the involvement is, and is it sort of a cycle that feeds on itself, and does it strike that person as that's the issue? I mean, a person could be confused about what the issue is and come to me with all this information, and I might suggest that this is something like an addictive cycle.
Have you ever seen anybody that you believed had lost control or was experiencing loss of control? How do you think about that? Have you ever seen somebody that looked like they were just totally incapable?
Like their lives revolved around this thing?
Or they got, well, when they drank or they used a drug, they lost all control of it. How do you react to that image or vignette?
That snapshot of a person losing control in a single night or something like that. Well,
do you think that exists? Have you seen it?
yeah. I mean, have I seen a person lose control when using a substance just in a single frame? Yeah, of course I have. I wouldn't consider that. I'm based on that information alone, I wouldn't say that person's addicted.
How do you differentiate that in your mind, a loss of control episode from an addiction? How would you differentiate that in your mind?
A loss of control episode sounds like somebody had a bad day. If somebody had a loss of control episode and was licking his wounds from that episode and said, well, what's the point anyway? I don't have anything going on, but I do have this alcohol, or I do have whatever it is. I'm going to turn back to that. At least I got a glimpse of hopefulness when I did that. And that continued. And then, every time somebody came down from that event, said, things are worse now than ever, but at least I have alcohol. That's that cycle that I'm talking about that feeds on itself.
And so the Life Process program, we emphasize something called relapse prevention. And what we try to do is to draw a line between having a bad night and, well, at the extreme, which sort of shouldn't happen, throwing their lives away.
Mm-hmm.
We want to draw a line. We don't even want it to extend beyond that one bad night. So you accept, what else are you going to do? If a person has had a night that they really disrespect and they didn't exert any control and they're embarrassed, that happens. It's happened to everybody in one form or another. And our job is simply to prevent that from extending as a definition of who they are for the near future and certainly for the ever future.
There are people I've talked to who have had, who have decided not to drink, say, in their lives. And for one reason or another, they drank one night and they hid it from people, and they drank and they had a bad night. Maybe they passed out or blacked out or did something embarrassing. And then they've come back from that. And they've drank one time in the last 10 years, and now they had this one event and they want to pay attention to it. They want to start thinking about, well, why I can't really figure out why I did that or why that's happening. And so, there's a therapeutic lens there that you say, maybe you could just be aware. Maybe there's things that you could turn your mind to consciously that you hadn't before, or you didn't do that night. I still wouldn't say that person has some sort of addiction, even though you might say, let's pay attention to this and let's figure out how you want to keep yourself from harm and how you want to build on things that you enjoy.
So there's two possible things, more than two, that we disagree with AA on. So a person goes out, they haven't drunk in 10 years, they get drunk. and you're now back to zero in AA.
Mhm.
You would say, well, you've been okay for 10 years, for God's sake.
Right.
Had a bad night. Let's not go crazy. You're on 10 years. That's solid ground. 5 years. We count that. That counts. And so that's throwing good money after bad. It's self-defeating. It makes no sense to us that AA would do that. The second thing that sometimes happens is I have a client in a different legal context. She got married. She joined AA at the age of 22. And she married a man she met in AA. And they had a child. I don't know. Can you see where this is going to go? After 9 years of being in AA, she quit AA. And she drank some alcohol and she smoked some pot. And she viewed AA as oppressive. And what she says to people is, I'm an adult who hasn't been intoxicated. I haven't been intoxicated in 9 years. I can drink some wine and smoke some pot. But her husband has a different reaction. And you can see there's a legal thing that evolves from that.
Right.
And, the issue legally is, can your ex-husband who believes in AA say, she can't do that because I don't believe I can do that? He's allowed to not believe he can do that. And then the legal cultural question, which I believe is shifted, is what's the court believe? And hopefully you come into court and you say, well, here's my credentials, here's my work. I've had this wine and some marijuana, and I'm living my life, and I'm a responsible person. And hopefully, do you feel that most courts can process that, or do you feel that most courts are still steeped in that AA abstinence thing? Do you have any?
Boy, you might know better, but I'm pessimistic. I think that a judge with a good head on his or her shoulders would say, well, geez, you seem perfectly successful. You wake up, you take your kid to school, and you do all the things you need to do. This is a good mom. I am curious about the irony that someone can self-proclaim they are an addict, and then they can join something like AA and then stop AA. And then that whole history and the self-described narrative actually kind of could work against you, because you could be seen as someone who's walking on eggshells if you're having a glass of wine or smoking some pot, as opposed to, I've never been an addict. I've drank excessively before. I drank the other night, but I do my responsibilities. That's a much more balanced story that gives you a better perspective about who that person is.
In other words, she knows what she's talking about.
Right.
And then I don't want to go too far in this case, but in this particular case, you have to prevent the person is working on custody of our child. You have to avoid, on your part, I'm not the lawyer, I'm a kind of a consultant, or the person engaging in this whole AA discussion. And
right.
Just talk about yourself. List your credentials and your obligations.
Right.
So we're trying to talk about, is there alcoholism? Is there addiction? We don't want to use the term reify those concepts. We don't want to certainly label people alcoholics or addicts. We recognize that there are behaviors that fall on the addiction spectrum, that people might want to shift themselves along the low line of that. A loss of control episode like blackout drinking or something equivalent to that is something to be avoided, but we don't count that in and of itself as determinative of addiction.
Right.
And these are all all of these ways of thinking have extremely concrete manifestation in terms of how we work in life process program, how we view society, and how we might consult on a legal or divorce case.
Well put. And by the way, you talked about the relapse prevention thing where AA might say you haven't drank for 5 years and then you did. And so now you lose the 5 years. I couldn't help but thinking about kids that I work with. And when a 10-year-old acts like somebody says, you're acting like you're 2. And I could imagine, an AA based way of talking being like, well, you're 2 now. You don't have 10 years of development or learning. You're only 2.
Well, I can project how you work. If you have a kid who's really improved, and your original background was as a behavior interventionist, that's when somebody freaks out and you come in. When somebody freaks out one day, it's just like what we were saying about a loss of control of drinking one day. Okay, time out. We don't want to keep doing that. Let's think about it. It's an object lesson, not a moral, to use Maya Salovitz's words, or a clinical decisive break. It's a little piece of information. And you have among your gifts is the gift of remaining pretty calm. Would you say when somebody does
in certain scenarios, yeah, that's certainly in my work.
Bad, you freak out less than average.
Sure.
We don't want to make any grandiose claims. So let's just end that. A good clinician is somebody that can hear bad things without overreacting, which means reacting more than the client's reacting.
Absolutely. Yeah, brilliantly put. Thank you again, Stanton.
Pleasure, as always, Zach. Au revoir.